I just want to point out what I thought was the common thread between the last two talks, and that is that, exculpatory evidence is irrelevant. The punishment has been determined, and it will be executed. And that was the situation with Troy Davis, and that's the continuing situation with Russell Maroon Schultz. And especially in this system, it sees black lives as interchangeable. That's the calculus of this system. It doesn't matter. They're going to punish somebody. It doesn't matter who. And I'd like to give it up for Jen Marlowe.
Hi everyone, it's really wonderful to be here with you. Thank you so much for coming out on such a sunny, beautiful day. I'm sure there's lots of outdoorsy activities that are appealing to folks, and so it's really wonderful to see reading and books being the priority on a day like today, and to see all of you. We have what's probably a somewhat unusual presentation today, and I hope it's one that you'll get a lot from. It's hard to say that I hope you'll enjoy it, because the subject matter makes it hard to enjoy, but I hope you will find it meaningful. I'm going to start off by introducing a woman who I have grown to know and love like a sister over these last 5 years since I've known your family. Kim, has it been 5 years? 6 years? 6 years actually. And Kimberly Davis is the sister of Troy Davis and Martina Davis-Correia, who I collaborated with to write the book I Am Troy Davis, and I'll talk in a few minutes more about that process. And Kimberly is just one of the most extraordinary human beings that I have ever met. When Troy was executed and when Martina was on her deathbed, they both said to Kimberly, "We need you to carry the mantle. We need you to be the one now for the family that's going to stand up and fight for justice and fight about the fight to abolish the death penalty, fight against the death penalty." And that is just what Kimberly has done without pause and without hesitation. She took up the mantle. I mean, she'd already been fighting, she'd already been struggling, but she stepped in a new role and in an energized capacity, and it is really nothing but an honor and an extraordinary privilege to be able to introduce you today to one of my heroes, Kimberly Davis.
This evening. As Jen said, my name is Kimberly Davis, and I'm the sister of Troy Anthony Davis, who was executed on Georgia's death row September 21st of 2011. With my brother's case, my brother was actually an innocent man that was on Georgia's death row. The state of Georgia, they wanted, like they said before, just to make someone suffer for a crime that was committed against a police officer that was killed. In my brother's case, there was I'm going back to the night of the actual shooting of the police officer. There was a homeless man that was actually pistol whipped by someone that was, fighting with him over a can of beer. The homeless man, he said that he heard a voice behind him. He never saw the voice that was behind him, but he told the police officers, he said the gentleman that pistol whipped me was actually the one that turned and shot the police officer. When this man got to the police department, Sylvester Red Coles, who was the other man on the scene, everyone said that night that Sylvester Red Coles had a gun, but the police never asked Sylvester Red Coles to produce a gun. When Sylvester Coles got to the police department, he actually fingered my brother as being the shooter. The homeless man that was actually beat, when he was giving his statement, he told the police officers, "That's the man that pistol whipped me, and that's the man that shot the police officers." By that time, the police had already had an all-points bulletin out on my brother, and they told the homeless man, they said, "No, you're mistaken, you're wrong. This is not the man that shot the police officer. He's here to help us." Larry Young asked the police to give him medical attention. He said he was bleeding profusely from his head from being pistol whipped. They told him the only way that he would be able to get medical attention is if he would sign a statement that says that my brother shot the police officer. He said that it was not right. They told him if he didn't tell them and sign a statement that my brother shot the police officer, that he was not going to get any medical attention. Granted, Larry Young did not make it to like the 5th grade. Larry Young could not read and write, more or less sign his signature. There was another young man that was actually involved, Darryl Collins, who was a 14-year-old, and they actually came and took him to the police department without his family, without his lawyers, and they told him that if you don't tell us what we need to know, if you don't tell us that Troy shot the police officer, he said that we'll have you arrested as an accomplishment. With my brother's trial, there was so much police misconduct because they had someone in their possession that was telling them that Sylvester Coles was the one that shot the police, but yet still at that time they had already had all points bulletin out against my brother. With my brother's case, even though we did get repealed with this the U.S. Supreme Court by granting him an evidentiary hearing back in Savannah, with the evidentiary hearing with Judge William Moore, that was the 11th Circuit that actually convicted him, and we said, they're bringing his case back to the same courts that convicted him, which was the 11th Circuit. Judge William Moore actually sat on the stand when there were 7 out of 9 witnesses that actually recanted their statements. One of the witnesses that did not recant his statement was actually Sylvester Coles, who was actually the gunman. The other witness actually died, but before she died, she did give a statement that stated that she had asked the police to help her, and that was the only way that they was going to be able to help her, was for her to sign a statement that stated that my brother shot the police officer. When we went before the evidentiary hearing, the 7 out of 9 witnesses that actually recanted their statements got up on the stands to testify, and you had Judge William Moore sitting on the stands with his eyes closed as if he was asleep, as if my brother's life didn't mean anything to him at all. You had them with the police intimidation because they had the witnesses actually sitting out in the hallway with the prosecutors with the police officers and the prosecutors that they were stating that they lied against. You had them sitting out there for an intimidation tactic. When you had one witness that actually got up and actually pointed out that the police officer told him, if you don't tell me what I need to know, if you don't tell me that Troy Davis shot the police officer, I'm going to throw you in jail and label you as a snitch. Out of the 20-year reign that Spencer Lawton, he was a former district attorney, was in reign, under Spencer Lawton, you had 3 other gentlemen that were on Georgia's death row that actually got their sentences overturned for prosecutorial misconduct under Spencer Lawton. Spencer Lawton was the same district attorney that actually charged my brother. With Spencer Lawton, all the evidence was locked up in his office for over 20 years. When we finally did get ready to go back to the evidentiary hearing, there was only 1 tape in that box that they can find. You had 9 witnesses that they interviewed, but you only had 1 tape that was found. The district attorney could not tell them where the other evidence went. But that 1 tape that they did find was actually one of the lead detectives that stated his name, and he actually said, if you don't tell me what I need to know, if you don't tell me Troy Davis shot the police officer, I'm going to throw you in jail and label you as a snitch. And you know what happens to snitches. Everybody in the courtroom were astonished because the officer actually sat on the stand and swore that he had never threatened an inmate like that. And they had that evidence that stated that that officer lied on the stand. There was nothing ever done with that officer that lied on the stand. 2 weeks before my brother got his final execution date, they had a new warden at the prison. For over 17 and a half years that my brother was on Georgia's death row, the former warden actually spoke up against him with the Georgia Parole Board on 2 occasions and told them not to execute my brother because he believed in his innocence. In December of 2010, you had Warden Humphreys that was actually appointed to be, 2009, you had Warden Humphreys that was actually appointed to be the warden over the prison. When Warden Humphreys got into prison, his first day meeting my brother, he told my brother, he said, your celebrity days are over. He said, there's a new sheriff in town and I'm going to make your last days on earth a living hell. My brother could not understand why the new warden would come to him with this. They used to have arts and craft where they used to be able to, make different, crocheting different items. Then he took the arts and craft away. They actually had where they can get commissary when they actually go and visit with their family members and friends on visitation day. He took away their commissary on the visitation day. And then it took away, he was locking them down. He put them on a 23-hour lockdown. They had 1 hour to either use the bathroom, go outside, or make a phone call. And, like the warden told him, he said, I'm going to break you one way or the other. 2 weeks before my brother had gotten his final execution date, Warden Humphreys came to my brother and told him, he said that you have another execution date coming. My brother actually called my sister and told my sister to call his lawyers, called the lawyers, and the lawyers told him, this is just an intimidation tactic, you don't have another date. But 2 weeks after that, that's when we actually found out that the Georgia Supreme Court, the 11th Circuit, did not grant my brother a new trial, and they were setting him another execution date. That was actually the 4th execution date that my brother was actually going to be coming upon. We received word from the U.S. Supreme Court that my brother was going to have another execution date. My mother passed. And like the doctors, that Monday that she went to the doctor took her off of 2 or 3 of her medications, gave her EKG and everything, told her her heart was fine, her blood pressure level was down. He said that he didn't need to see her for another 6 to 9 months. And so when they actually took her to the hospital, they said that she didn't have a heart attack, she didn't have any blood clots, anything. Said that she just died of natural causes. When the day that my brother was executed, the warden of the prison actually came to Benjamin Targelis, who's the president of the NAACP, and he asked Ben, he said, "Do you know who I am?" And Ben said, "Yeah, you're the warden of the prison." He said, "No, do you really know who I am?" And Ben asked him, he's like, "Who are you?" He said, "I was a police officer on the streets of Savannah in 1989 when Officer McPhail got shot." He said, "I was not involved directly," he said, "but I was involved indirectly." And like Ben said, that was actually a violation of my brother's civil rights, constitutional rights, all kind of rights were actually violated. So that was the reason why that warden was giving my brother such a hard time, because he was actually a police officer on the streets of Savannah in 1989. And like he told my brother, he was going to make his last days on earth a living hell. And we used to have contact visits with them. We went to see my brother 17 and a half years straight. We went every single Saturday to see my brother on death row. And then my brother told us, he said that, y'all have your lives to live. He said, don't come up here every Saturday. We stopped going every Saturday, going every other Saturday, but yet still, we were still there fighting for my brother's life. We had people in Savannah that, wanted to sign petitions that said that they couldn't sign petitions because of their jobs. They didn't want their jobs to be affected. And I mean, it was just, just so many things that went forward. But when we did get almost a million petitions that we took to the Georgia Supreme Court, to the parole board, trying to get my brother a new trial. The state of Georgia, they had in their mind that they had made a mistake, and the only way that they can correct that mistake was trying to keep my brother's voice silent by executing him. When the day my brother was getting ready to be executed, my brother told us, he said that if the state of Georgia succeeds in executing me, he said that they would only take my physical body. He said they would not take my soul, because I gave my life over to God a long time ago. Many people ask me and my family, how do y'all, handle this? How do you, go through this? Like my mom said, she gave that burden to the Lord a long time ago, and God, kept us through this. Like I said, a family that prays together, stays together, and we are still a family that's praying together, and still a family that is staying together. When my sister Martina, she was actually diagnosed with breast cancer 10 and a half years before she passed, and actually only gave her 6 months to live. She almost made it to her son's graduation. She died December 1st. My nephew graduated December 1st, 2011. My nephew graduated June 12th, 2012. She almost made it to his graduation, but she told me, she said that it's time for you to take up the mantle. She said, it's time for you to continue to fight this death penalty, and to continue to fight to clear my brother's name. And that's what I've been doing, still going around spreading the news about my brother's case, because there was grave prosecutorial misconduct in my brother's case that the police did not want people to know about. Yet still, when we tried to find information out about Warden Humphreys, the only thing we can find out about him was that he was the date that he was actually appointed to be the warden of the prison. As far as his record with the police force, from the police academy, couldn't find any records on him on the police academy, but yet still, we talked to officers that actually served on the police force with him during that time, and the officers actually stated that he was a police officer back in 1989, but we could not find any information on him. The Sylvester Coles actually was the one that that the people stated that they saw him with the gun, saw him shoot the police officer. Sylvester Coles was in and out of jail ever since he was at the age of 13 years old. If you look up the police record for Sylvester Coles, you cannot find any information. on Sylvester Coles. His entire arrest record was wiped clean. But I'm here today to let everyone know we are going to continue to fight the death penalty. We are going to continue until we stop the death penalty. We're going to break it down city by city, state by state. But one day we are going to end the death penalty. And I ask all of you that are here today to join with me, Amnesty International and NAACP. Let your voices be heard. That's going to be the only way that we're going to be able to end this death penalty, stop this prosecutorial misconduct. You know, the police, they want to do this intimidation tactic, but we have voices that need to be heard. And like they said, knowledge is powerful. We need to get up and speak out. It's okay for us to come and sit down in a gathering like this, but it takes more than us sitting down, more than us speaking. We all have to get out and do work. Let these officials know, because I mean, those officials, they're actually elected officials. They're working for us. If they're not doing the jobs that we want them to do, then we need to get their behinds out and get somebody in that's going to do what we want them to do. So we need to stand up and let our voices be heard. And I ask y'all to join with me and continue to fight against the death penalty. Thank you.
So you probably got a small idea about why I said that Kimberly Davis is one of my personal heroes. And her brother, Troy Anthony Davis, and her sister, Martina Davis-Correia, are also two of my heroes. And I want to speak just briefly about how I came to work with Martina and with Troy on helping them tell their story, on helping them write their book. And then I want you to be able to hear some from the book itself. And by the way, for folks who want to walk away with a copy of it, there are copies in the tent right next door at the Haymarket Books table. There's I think a fresh box of books over there. And there's also in the back where, can you wave, Jiva? Where Jiva is waving with the blue I Am Troy Davis. We've got t-shirts, I Am Troy Davis t-shirts, and we've also got the book there. And all the proceeds from the t-shirts and a portion of the proceeds from the books go for Troy's niece and nephew's education funds. So it's a way to directly support the next generation. I came upon Troy's story by hearing his sister Martina speak on Democracy Now! And it was right after Troy had survived his first execution date. As Kim mentioned, when Georgia finally succeeded in killing Troy, it was their fourth attempt. He had survived 3 previous execution dates. The first one was in 2007. He survived that by 23 hours. The next day, I heard Martina speak on Democracy Now! I immediately thought she was a force of nature. And she talked about that battle that Kimberly was telling about, fighting to prove her brother's innocence, fighting for her brother's life, at the same time fighting for her own life. Because when she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2001, at that time she was given 6 months to live. So she was in this double struggle to fight for her own life so she could continue to fight for her brother's life and continue to raise her phenomenal son, who's now a 19-year-old incredible young man starting his first year of college at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And I heard, yeah, we can clap for that. We can clap for Dejan. He's definitely worth some applause. And when I heard Martina speak, I had never heard about Troy's case. And I started doing some research. I found the report that Amnesty International had written about Troy. It had come out in February of 2007, called Where is the Justice for Me? And the report laid out, so much of what you heard Kim talk about, so many layers of things that were so deeply problematic in Troy's case. This report just laid it all out in empirical black and white. It talked about the 9 key witnesses who testified against Troy at trial, and how 7 out of those 9 had later recanted, many of them saying they had been coerced or intimidated by the police into implicating Troy at trial. It laid out the fact that out of the 2 key witnesses who did not recant, one of them was the alternative suspect who Kim talked about today, Sylvester Red Coles, the very man who had gone to the police and gave them the name Troy Davis. It talked about the fact that other witnesses said they had seen this man, Sylvester Red Coles, pull the trigger, seen him with the gun that night, all the different pieces that you heard just Kim talking about. It was all laid out. I was horrified. How could someone be in prison, let alone slated for death, on evidence that was so flimsy and so problematic? I wrote a letter to Troy. He wrote back. When he found out that I was a documentary filmmaker, he suggested that I make a film not about him. He said, you should make a film about Martina, his sister. And he said that's a story of love and tribulation and triumph that would inspire anyone. And then when I met Martina about a year later, she mentioned not a film, but she mentioned a book, that she had been thinking about writing a book. People had been telling her she should write a book and that she'd like to, but she'd need to work with someone on it. And so I asked her if she would want me to be that person, and then we started working on it. And we started working on it around the end of 2009, but we were working on it in bits and pieces, and Troy participated as well. In the book, there's many of Troy's own reflections, thoughts, memories, and writings. We devised a system. The first time I visited Troy on death row, we figured out a system where he could contribute through phone calls and through letter writing, but in a way that it wouldn't be obvious, because the prison authorities wouldn't permit Troy to participate in writing a book. But as long as we found a system of, I would write him a letter, and in the letter I would just say, "Oh, Troy, what are some of your earliest childhood memories?" And Troy would understand that that was for the book, and then he'd write pages and pages of his childhood memories, knowing that that would be used for the book. But we did it in a way that wasn't overt. And same thing with when we did work over the phone. And now I lost my train of thought. So we did start working on the book in 2009, but in many ways the book was on the back burner because the much more urgent task was trying to prevent the execution. Anything that I could do, whether it was writing articles, making videos, doing shorter things that would have more immediate impact, that the hope was it would influence the outcome and save Troy. And it wasn't until after Troy was executed, I got a call about a week, it was actually exactly a week after Troy's funeral, I got a call from Martina. Now, Martina had been battling for her life the whole summer leading up to Troy's execution. Over the last couple years, her health had slowly started to decline, and the summer of 2011, she spent most of the summer in the hospital. And when Troy received his execution date, and we still had hope that that execution would ultimately not happen, but when he received the date, Martina was in the hospital, and about 4 days before the execution, Martina all but busted out of the hospital because she was determined she was going to be there with and for Troy. On the funeral, she'd gotten a letter from Troy, and it was postmarked September 21st, 2011, which was the day that Troy was killed. She had not been able to bring herself to open it until then, the week after his funeral. And when she finally opened it, there was one sentence within the letter that Troy wrote to her, that final letter, when he said to her, "Make sure you finish writing your book." So she called me right then and she said, "This book is now my top priority." And a lot of the work that was left to be done in terms of my interviewing Martina was the most painful material. It was talking about the lead up to the execution itself. I said to Martina, we don't have to do that right now. We can go back and work on some childhood memories and things like that. Maybe we should wait till these memories aren't as traumatic and aren't as fresh and raw. And it was Martina who said, "No, let's do it now while it is still fresh." And so we plunged in over Skype, over telephone, using every spare minute of time. Martina often in great pain, agony really, with all the procedures that she'd been having and fighting for her life. And in retrospect, I can't help but wonder if Martina knew deep down inside at some level, although she wasn't done fighting, but if she knew that her time was limited, and she wanted to make sure that she fulfilled what Troy told her to do in that final letter and make sure her book got written. And what I would like to do now is actually ask a few friends and colleagues and fellow warriors in the abolition movement to be the ones to read to you some of those passages from Martina and Troy's book, the book that I had the honor of working with them to bring into the world. And if I could ask Jiva and Jasmine to join on stage. Brian will come back up later when we have a bit of a discussion. And then you will just be able to read from your seats because I think all those mics are working. I'm gonna introduce just each person and explain how they're connected to the case or to Troy or to the struggle. And I'm going to briefly set up the passage that they're going to read so it just makes sense. And we're going to hear 4 brief passages from the book. The first reader doesn't need much of an introduction because you've met her, Kimberly Davis. She is going to read a passage from 2007. It's that first execution date that I was talking about, the one that was stayed just 23 hours before the execution. This passage takes place just after the parole board hearing finished, and the family was sitting and waiting in the hotel room, sitting on pins and needles, waiting to learn whether the parole board was going to grant Troy clemency or stay the execution, or if they would proceed with the execution, which was scheduled to be the next day at 7 p.m.
July 16, 2007. An unfamiliar number appeared on Martina's caller ID at 8 p.m. Hello, Martina. Yes. This is the New York Times. How do you feel? Martina replied, how do I feel about what? About Troy's stay. Martina replied, what stay? The parole board gave Troy a 90-day stay of execution. Martina threw the phone down and began to leap around the hotel. Troy gotta stay, Troy gotta stay, she screamed. Just then, Mama's cell rang. Mama punched through the numbers as quickly as she could to hear Troy's voice. Hey Mama, how'd the hearing go? Mama had her cell phone and put her cell phone on speaker so Troy could hear Martina as she was still dancing and shouting. You hear that, honey? The family huddled around for Mama's cell phone to hear Troy's reaction. For a moment, there was a silence, an almost inaudible, thank you, God, followed by another, thank you, God, and a little louder, thank you, God. Troy did something he did regularly, was pray. Then he did something almost he never did. Troy began to cry. 2 guards led him from the death house back to his cell block. Fellow death row inmates lined up at their doors of the cell, extending their arms to the iron bars and grasping Troy's hand as he walked down the row. Praise God, brother, one man called out to him in tears in his eyes. Maybe at least one of us will survive this place. Another cheered. Troy's friends shoved small items through the doors that he can take back to his cell. These were items that Troy gave to them the previous day. A bottle of shampoo, some extra stamps, a few envelopes, his shoes and belts. Troy, with his head held high, a new spring in his step, walked into his cell. He heard a familiar clank, the sound of the cell door locking behind him. But at that moment, he was not focused on the confinement. He was focused on his life. George had intended to take it from him in less than 23 hours. He and his family and scores of supporters had fought, and they were prevailed.
The next passage is going to be read by Jiva Mansky. Jiva is a field organizer with Amnesty International, and you'll also be hearing later from Gerald Stansberry. Amnesty International and NAACP were 2 of the organizations that really mobilized not just hundreds, not just thousands, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide to prevent the execution. And a lot of that kind of work is the very slow movement building work that probably, so many of us are involved in, which is, person by person, relationship by relationship. And that's the kind of work that Jiva does day in and day out, building those networks that build the movement. Jiva's going to read a passage that comes from Troy's early days on death row. It was 1993. Troy had been on death row just 2 years at that point. He had already survived a few executions of other inmates. He had already lived through a few people being executed. But when Chris Berger was executed, it was different for Troy because Chris Berger was Troy's closest friend on death row.
Troy had never intended to make friends on death row, but there was something disarming about Chris Berger. Chris was tall, trim, strong, and gave off a tough demeanor, but he showed warmth and affection to his friends. He sketched beautifully with colored pencils, often sending his drawings to his mother, to whom he was devoted. He was older than Troy by more than 10 years, but there was something vulnerable and childlike about him, perhaps stemming from his history of severe childhood abuse. Chris had been only 17 years old when he had participated in the murder of Roger Honeycutt. When his execution date was set for December 7th, 1993, he confessed to Troy how frightened he was. Troy saw the guards parading Chris sadistically in front of the other death row inmates on the evening of December 7th before leading him to the execution chamber to strap him into the electric chair. Troy sat in his cell, hunched over on his bed, waiting for the horrifying moment when the lights would flicker, indicating that a high-voltage current of electricity was coursing through Chris's body. Every man on death row twitched in silent agony when the flickering began at 9:50 p.m. Troy knelt on the hard floor, gripping the steel frame of his bed tightly, and prayed for his friend. Only later did he learn that Chris Berger's last words had been an apology to everyone he had ever hurt and a plea for forgiveness. One of the guards who had paraded Chris leaned against the bars of Troy's cell. "Hey, Davis," Troy heard the guard say. Troy looked up. "Yeah? How'd you like some fries to go with your burger?" Troy resolved never to become quite so close to anyone else on death row again.
The next passage is going to be read by Gerald Stansberry, and we'll be hearing more from Mr. Stansberry later. He is the president of the Maryland State Conference for the NAACP. The passage he's going to read comes from just before Troy's second execution date, which was in 2008. One reason I chose this passage is because the passage you just heard Jiva read highlighted a really horrifically cruel guard. And there were horrifically cruel guards, and there still are in prisons and death rows all over the country. But there are also guards that show humanity and compassion. And the passage Mr. Stansberry is going to read is going to highlight that. And I think it's important to note that for a lot of reasons, one of which is I think it's so easy to blame, monstrosity on an individual, where it's not about the individual, it's about the system. It's the systemic monstrosity of the existence of death row, of the existence of mass incarceration that we have to be resisting. It's not about the individual guards and the spectrum of behavior that they might show.
Martina was more numb than shocked as she read the parole board statement. After an exhaustive review of all available information regarding the Troy Davis case, and after considering all possible reasons for granting clemency, the board has determined that clemency is not warranted. What had happened behind those closed doors with that prosecution? Had the board held any real deliberation, or were they just trying to protect their system, as the courts did? Was this decision the result? What had happened behind those closed doors with the prosecution? Had the board held any real deliberation, or were they just trying to protect their system as the courts did? Was this decision the result of a backdoor deal with the prosecutors? This case illustrates the deep flaws in the application of the death penalty in this country. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter wrote, calling on the board to reconsider its decision. Executing Troy Davis without a real examination of potentially exonerating evidence resists taking the life of an innocent man and would be a grave miscarriage of justice. Amnesty issued an appeal for the board to reverse this decision and organize a demonstration in which 300 people marched from Woodruff Park in downtown Atlanta to Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. But the board refused to reconsider, and the Georgia Supreme Court would not grant a stay of execution. 2 days before the scheduled September 23rd execution, Troy was moved for the second time to a holding cell in the death house, where 2 correctional officers monitored him around the clock. Martina's cell phone rang at 2 a.m. the following morning, pulling her from the anxiety-ridden sleep she had been drifting in and out of. "Hello," she answered groggily. "I just want you to know that Troy is doing okay," the caller said in a hushed voice. "We're making sure he's warm and that he has food. We're taking turns praying," and fell into her first real sleep since the parole board had announced its decision. Even on the inside of that horrible place, there were people looking out for Troy. And the final passage is going to be read by Jasmine Heist. Did I pronounce your name right, Jasmine?
Jasmine is a campaigner for Amnesty International who focuses on individuals and communities who are at risk. So the connection between folks who are on death row, not just in the U.S. but all over the world, and Jasmine's work as a campaigner is pretty clear. And Jasmine's going to read a passage from 2001 when Martina was first diagnosed with aggressive cancer. She was given 6 months to live, as we both mentioned initially, and she ended up outliving her diagnosis for a decade longer than that. And partly this passage will show you the kind of fighting spirit that Martina had, and indeed that the whole Davis family has.
It was another bad night of vomiting, retching, and diarrhea. Martina stayed curled up in bed in the morning, listening to the sounds of Mama getting Dejan ready, and then everyone leaving the house. In another few weeks, her son would be 7 years old. In another few months, her brother would have spent 10 years on death row. Martina scratched her head, coming away with a clump of hair. She stared at the fistful of hair for a long moment before pushing back the blanket, slowly sitting up in bed and pushing her feet into her slippers. She had a child to raise and a brother to get off of death row. It was time to get up. Martina opened the front door. She took one shuffling step and then another, making it as far as the mailbox, against which she leaned for support, feeling the warm Georgia sun beat down on her face. "Tina, you all right?" It was her neighbor from across the street. "I'm all right." She let the sun warm her for a few more minutes. She might be dying, but she wasn't dying today. She made her way back into the house and, without fully realizing what she was doing, found herself in the bathroom, rubbing a generous amount of Nair onto her head. When Dejan came home that afternoon, Martina was waiting for him on the couch, wearing her favorite dress and her head fully wrapped in a colorful scarf with an African motif. As he approached to give her a hug, she pulled off the scarf, unveiling a shiny, bald head. Dejan jumped back for a moment. Then he wrapped his arms around her and squeezed her tightly. "It doesn't look bad, Mom. You look really pretty today." She got up the next day and walked a few steps further. "Come on, let's walk down the street," her neighbor suggested the day after that. Martina took her hand, and they slowly made their way to the corner and back. When Trevor picked her up to take her to chemo, Martina was fully made up, wearing jewelry in loud Caribbean colors. "I might have cancer," she told him when he looked at her quizzically, "but cancer doesn't have me." Martina's strength slowly returned, and as her renewed strength lasted, she decided that not only was she not dying today, she also wasn't dying tomorrow. She likely wasn't dying next week, or even next month. She could take a deep breath, relax, and live her life without worrying that every moment might be her last. Perhaps her illness was her creator's way of telling her, "I need your attention. There's more that I need you to do, and I need you to do it more abundantly." If she wasn't dying today, then she was going to live today.
Thank you so much for all of our readers. We can clap. Part of the legacy that Troy and Martina left behind, that mantle that Kim was talking about lifting up, has to do with the continued fight to abolish the death penalty. And so I'm going to ask, where's Brian? Brian Evans to come back up, and Kim, you could stay there because there'll be questions later. Brian Evans, who's coming up, is Amnesty International USA's Death Penalty Abolition Campaign Director, and he and Mr. Gerald Stansberry, who's Maryland's NAACP State Conference President. I'd just like to ask you, a few minutes of discussion really about. Y'all probably know this. There was a huge campaign right here in Maryland that ended the death penalty, and it goes into legislative effect, did you say on Tuesday, Brian? October 1st? And I'd like you to discuss, both the fight that remains here in Maryland, because I think there's still ways that the struggle here is not done, but also what lessons you think can be learned from the success you had in Maryland and how those could be applied to other states that are still in the midst of their own struggle.
Sure. So In Maryland, as you all may know, the death penalty law was abolished, and that goes into effect October 1st. There are still 5 people on death row in Maryland, however. The law was not retroactive, so there's still a little fight left. We think Governor O'Malley is going to commute those sentences eventually, but there's no guarantees with politicians ever, as we all know. So we need to keep vigilant about that to make sure that death row is cleared. The year before this year, Connecticut abolished the death penalty. They still have 11 people on death row. That law was also not retroactive. So even in states where the death penalty has been abolished, there's still people on death row. And of course, the Troy Davis story touches on things that are much bigger than the death penalty, things that we're very familiar with, the police misconduct, the prosecutor misconduct. There's still, in Maryland and elsewhere, a lot of work to be done to address this problem. And I think one of the things about the death penalty is, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and there's no more absolute power than the power to kill a defenseless prisoner. Removing that power, I think, helps us address some of these other issues, but we still have 32 states with that power, and so we have a long way to go to address these sort of larger problems of sort of arbitrary impunity in the police, and this prosecutorial power, or this lack of accountability for prosecutors. The prosecutors and police that investigated and prosecuted Troy Davis have never been looked into for what they did in that case. There are plenty of other cases like Troy's where prosecutors and police have not been held to account. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, and then not even to touch on the sort of racial dynamic we have in our criminal justice system as a whole, and as well as our death penalty system. So we're making progress, that there's more of an awareness, and I think the Troy Davis case tapped into that our system is kind of corrupt. Our criminal justice system is kind of corrupt, and we know that it's kind of cruel. The Troy Davis case you really got to see the whole picture of the cruelty and corruption of our system in a way you don't normally see, because you just sort of see a flash. Oh, that guy was executed, that's terrible. But the Troy Davis case went on for 4 years, 4 execution dates. We really got to see the corruption and the cruelty of the system as a whole, and it opened a lot of people's eyes. But the question is now, of course, what are we going to do to address that now that we have people's attention?
Brian was absolutely right. And where I see Troy Davis' legacy for us is that he has reminded us, as Brian said, how unjust the system is, and it's one that we got to stamp out. That's the legacy. He has pointed this out to us up in our face. Right here in Maryland, I don't know if you all remember John Snowden. He was a young man, 1919, was accused of rape and killing a young lady, and he was pulled out of his cell and murdered. Well, just a few years ago, Governor Glenn Denning gave him a posthumous pardon because he was later found innocent. One thing about America, we forget. Okay, we had Jenna Six, we had John Snowden. You turn around, and what Troy Davis had kind of pointed out to us, that there is no justice for a black person in the United States. There is no justice. Troy Davis was not proven guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's what I grew up doing. In order to kill be accused of, convicted of murder, you have to, one, be convicted without a shadow of a doubt. That was the premise that we all lived on. And now here you got all this doubt, and they still killed Troy anyway. Something is wrong with that picture. We cannot forget. I am so happy about the book. I'm so happy about what you're doing, because this is the thing that's going to make America conscious. And I'm sure one day, maybe 80 years, like John Snowden, they come back with a posthumous pardon to pardon Troy Davis. However, it's not going to do him any good. We need to make sure now that our politicians understand that the death penalty did not work. And we made them understand that in Maryland, and I give Maryland a clap. The NAACP, Amnesty International, Casa de Maryland, just so many groups came together on that one accord. And believe me, I know we heard all the tragic murder cases and all those kind of things saying, yeah, that person deserves death row. Well, what if one innocent person is killed? You want to think about an innocent person in Maryland? Look at Kirk Bloodsworth. That man spent, 9 years in prison. Unfortunate to Troy Davis compared to what happened with Kirk, he got a retrial. When they gave him a retrial, they said, okay, no, we're going to give him life sentence. Then they gave him another trial, and that's when the DNA came back and released him after 9 years. This man was sentenced to die. Amnesty International put this information out, and a couple other groups, according to what I read. 142 people were exonerated who were on death row. 142. So that's why the death penalty needs to be repealed. Now, if something didn't come up with this DNA, these innocent people would have been sent to either some gas chamber or some electric chair. So this is why we feel that the death penalty all over the United States need to be repealed. We know we're not perfect. All right, there's a lot of mistakes made. Troy Davis' case, Troy should never, he should have the opportunity to prove his innocence. A life without parole is cheaper than the death penalty. Appeal after appeal after appeal, it cost us more. Maryland got the life. Okay, we're number 18 that has now passed the death penalty. We're working on Delaware. We're working on Delaware, it's too close. Okay, and so we're all working together all across the state to make sure that there is no death penalty in the United States. And that's the only thing I can say to you, because again, Troy told us, showed us. Look at the Trayvon Martin. He told us, he showed us. Look at Jim 6. They showed us. John Snowden, they showed us. Kirk Bloodworth, $300,000, didn't do anything for 9 years in prison, thinking that you're going to die and you're an innocent man. So, again, help us. Cause not work. That's all I can say.
Thank you. I was going to ask another question, but that was such an impassioned plea that I think I'll leave questions now for the audience. So if anyone has questions either for Mr. Stansberry, Gerald Stansberry, Brian Evans, Kimberly Davis, or myself.
If you have a question, we do ask that you speak into the microphone, and I just want to note that it is being recorded, so if you're not comfortable being recorded, please don't ask a question. I'll be over there.
Thank you all for your hard work, and I met a young man from Rwanda today, across from where I work, and I firmly believe in the worth of one person, and he reinforced to me how more than 800,000 people were killed. It's just one genocide. He said it was closer to 1 million and maybe more. So I wanted to get y'all's opinion on the problem and the problems facing the enormity of these problems, and what would your answers be to the juxtaposition of those two situations?
Thank you. That's a really good question. One interesting thing to note internationally is how 2/3 of the world's countries have abolished the death penalty. Rwanda abolished the death penalty in 2007 after the horrible genocide. And a lot of countries like South Africa after the end of apartheid, and a lot of countries from Eastern Europe after the fall of communism have abolished the death penalty because they see it as they want to stop that cycle of violence. And when you give the government the power to kill, you're just enabling that cycle to continue. So a lot of countries like Rwanda have recognized that if you want to stop the killing, you have to start by stopping the government's official, licensed, legalized killing. There's still a lot of killing that goes on, obviously, in Rwanda and in Congo and throughout Africa, and of course in the United States as well. But abolishing the death penalty is seen by more than 2/3 of the world's countries, and now more than 1/3 of our states in the United States, as really essential to stopping this cycle of violence. And so that's, I guess that would be what I would say to that.
Just one thing I would add to that. I mean, I think part of the international culture that allows like what happened in Rwanda to happen, that allows what's happening in Syria right now to happen, has to do with a lack of a culture of human rights overall, and a lack of vigorous respect for protecting human beings and protecting human rights as part of really the international culture. And I think as long as there are countries where the government is executing their prisoners, that's further eroding overall the sense of a protection for and a respect for a culture of human rights. And as long as that overall fabric of human rights is being frayed so widely, we're never going to be able to adequately address crises like Rwanda and like Syria. So in my mind, it is all very much interconnected. Any other questions? Oh, up front.
Let me bring this microphone over to you, okay?
And then Kim Davis is coming right back if anyone had a question for her. She's...
Given what's been said about the prosecution office in Georgia and the evidence, the so-called evidence against Troy being found to be fabricated. I know it's only been 2 years since Troy Davis' death, but has there been any significant change in the Georgia prosecution's office in terms of maintaining files on testimony that might lead to exoneration?
As far as the authorities in Georgia are concerned, the case is closed, it's over. They have absolutely no interest in wanting that to be reopened, re-examined, or challenged. Amnesty and NAACP and other organizations have been calling for a new investigation into the problems in Troy's case, and we'll all keep calling for that. But in terms of, from the perspective of the state of Georgia, part of the reason that they went ahead with the execution is because they didn't want to admit that they were wrong in their original conviction. It was such a commitment to that they made a decision early on that, Troy's the guy we're going to get, come hell or high water, and they got him, and they kept him, and they executed him, and part of the whole problem was an inability to go back and be like, whoa, hold on, maybe someone screwed up somewhere along the line. So they're sure not interested in doing that now that Troy's already executed. But that's why we have to keep pushing them, and we have to keep pressuring them, and I hope this book will be a part of this. In some ways, I see this book as an alternative form of justice, because the Davis family certainly didn't get justice in the court system. And I think I see Brian nodding. I don't know if he has something to add to that.
If I recall correctly, I think there was one minor regulatory change in the way police interview potential witnesses in criminal cases going forward, which is, a little something, but that doesn't help with past cases and that does happen. I mean, most death sentences nationally are overturned. So yeah, I'm sure that there's been some death sentences overturned. What we've learned with all the DNA exonerations since the early mid-90s is that eyewitness evidence is the weakest form of evidence in the world. It's the most unreliable. Even 10 minutes after you see something, people will say, "Oh, it's a white shirt. Oh, it's a blue shirt." People are not reliable sources of information. We've learned that, and but this is not applied to past cases because once you're convicted, you're presumed guilty, and it's almost impossible to get back into a situation where you can prove your innocence. That's a real challenge. It was a real challenge for Troy Davis, and a challenge for a lot of other people who were convicted because of eyewitness testimony.
And I was just going to add sort of a statistical backup to what Brian said. If I'm remembering my numbers correctly, shockingly, 75% of wrongful convictions were because of mistaken eyewitness testimony. And out of that 75%, 50% of those mistaken eyewitnesses had to do with police coercion and intimidation. So, and then if you multiply that, if you look at how many people we have locked up in prisons, and in the US it's a higher percentage of our population than any country in the world, you begin to see how the death penalty in many ways is the sharp edge of a deeply broken criminal justice system.
Hi. I'm wondering what you all think about the impact of white people claiming I am Troy Davis or wearing the shirt is, and whether or not you all think it obscures the anti-black violence committed within the criminal legal system, both legally and illegally.
I'm gonna make it short and sweet. Whenever I see white people stand up for justice, I applaud them. Okay, because it takes courage. That's what and too many times, I mean, if you think back about the civil rights movement, there were whites in front of that civil rights movement as well. And I'm so happy when I see them because that's what justice is all about. We all want the same things. You want a quality of life, I want a quality of life. You want things, we all want the same thing. We want peace. We don't want violence, okay? So when I see us standing in unity, like I stand with this man, Brian, and that's how we stood when we was down there, the governor and everyone else had to listen to us because we weren't just standing with a bunch of black folks complaining. No, that's not the way it was. It wasn't a bunch of white folks against us, fighting against us because we wanted to stop the death penalty. We fought together because injustice for us is just as much injustice for you. That could be your child. Okay, or my child, my son, or your brother. That could be any one of us. We want to make sure that justice is justice. That's what it's called for all of us, not just for some of us. So I appreciate anyone wearing that same flag for Troy Davis. So thank you.
And the story actually of how the slogan "I am Troy Davis" came to be is actually in a book. There's a really interesting story about how that phrase became the catchphrase of the movement.
Any further questions?
So, I'm a defense attorney and I support abolition, so I'm not trying to be antagonistic about this, but sir, you mentioned Trayvon Martin, and Trayvon Martin was a victim. So what do you say to the victims and the families of the victims?
Well, you know, they want justice too. And I think they would want to make sure that the justice was actually served. Now, I heard a couple read that they smiled when they came out after the execution. But what if that one doubt said, wait a minute, you may have just executed the wrong person? Okay, that doesn't bring any justice. Victims' rights groups actually stood with us against the death penalty. They said, but coming back to court in appeal after appeal didn't bring any peace to them. You remember the victim rights advocates? And they also said it was they'd rather see some of that funds go toward helping the families of the victims rather than being spent in the system trying to execute someone. So again, Troy was a victim. You're absolutely right. Okay, and to those victims, our hearts go out to them too. But they only want justice too. They don't want the wrong person being executed. And if they ever find out for sure that, and when the evidence comes out that Troy Davis was innocent, I just as Troy said, God bless their souls. If you think back, John Snowden said, I will not die with a lie on my lips as he was being hung. Troy Davis, as he was being executed, looked over to the family and said, I am not responsible. Now this man had God in his heart. Now he's about ready to see his maker, and you tell me he's not going to take that deathbed confession if there was the opportunity for him to say, yes, I committed this crime. I believe Troy Davis was innocent. I don't believe he would have went to his deathbed saying that he did not do something he did.
I could just add to the murder victims. And one of the things we tried to do in Maryland was, at the same time abolishing the death penalty, we would create a fund to support victims' families. That was taken out of the bill. The bill passed, but in addition to getting the 5 death sentences commuted, we need to make sure that we support victims' families in Maryland and across the country so that this false sort of like, okay, we'll give you the death penalty because we're not going to give you any real support, that we can get rid of that ridiculous option and give victims' families some real support. Hopefully we can do that in Maryland, and hope we can do that everywhere else. And that'll make it a lot easier for us to get rid of the death penalty, which is often held out as a sort of false promise to victims' families in lieu of actual, real support that they need.
Gerald had very poignantly alluded to Troy's final statements. And if there are no further questions, I actually want to play Troy's last words for you because they were recorded. And it's very powerful to hear what were the last things Troy determined that he wanted to say while he was already strapped on the gurney, awaiting the injection of 3 different drugs. One that was going to numb him, one that was going to paralyze him, and one that was going to stop his heart. And these are the words that he wanted us to say. And in those words, there's a call to action for all of us. And I'm hoping it's a little bit of a DIY situation. I'm hoping that just holding the microphone up to the laptop means that we'll be able to hear him over the music that's playing somewhere.
First of all, I'd like to address the Davis family and let you all know that despite the situation, you still the person that killed your father, your son, your brother. I am innocent. Incidents that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun that night. I did not shoot your brother. I'm so sorry for your loss. I really am sincere. All I can ask is that each of you look deeper into this case so that you really finally see the truth. I ask to my family and friends that you all continue to pray, that you all continue to forgive, continue to fight this fight. Those who try to about to take my life, God have mercy on all of your soul. God bless you all.
Among Troy's final words to all of us was that we continue to fight this fight. And I hope that when we leave the tent today, when we leave the book festival, when we go back home, that it's great if there's, conversation about, what an interesting program, but then I hope the conversation doesn't then just turn to, what should we get for dinner, and end there, and stop there. I hope the next step to that conversation is, how can I be a part of that fight? And that fight, yes, it's to end the death penalty, but it's also the fight to make our criminal justice system one that works, that protects society, rather than targeting huge communities within our society. That fight is standing up to oppression or injustice wherever we see it and deciding that we're not going to walk away from it. But like Kimberly Davis has been doing for years and her family's been doing for decades, standing up, speaking out, and becoming part of the struggle. So I want to thank everyone for being here, Gerald and Brian and everyone who read, Jasmine, Jiva, of course Kimberly Davis, and all of you, the Baltimore Book Festival. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to be here with all of you today, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. The authors will be back here selling and signing the books, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming.